got a bunch of folks who are emailing questions in. As we get some of those sorted, I thought I'd kind of ask you one, just because it's from my experience. I've had a lot of folks tell me when I was working on new technology, well, the one thing you need to do when you're working on developing a new technology and thinking about commercializing it is protect your IP and protect the secret sauce you have. And basically, you know, there's this whole concept of being in stealth mode, right? And I was realizing as I was listening here, you know, stealth seems to be a little bit at odds with getting out of the building and talking to a bunch of folks about what you're doing. So what's your take on stealth?
Well, you know, stealth mode kind of implies that you could learn more by sitting in your garage than getting out and talking to people. And all these are trade-offs, but I think history has shown that spending time actually getting some data and validating your hypotheses is actually much, much better than just kind of squirreled away in a corner. That's number one. But number two is, you know, saying that if somehow I go out and talk to people, I'm going to, you know, lose all my patents, just kind of misunderstands what the goal of customer discovery is, because no one is suggesting that what you're doing is presenting your firmware or IP or key technology. If you understand the core idea about customer development is to listen and understand customers' problems and needs. So if you find yourself talking a lot about your technology, you might be doing something, but not customer development. Most of it requires listening. If you finally get people incredibly interested who say, yes, we're ready to buy, by then you could ask for an NDA. But that should be months into a discussion with a single customer. The third piece is, well, it's not about my patents. It's about my idea is so good that I don't want to share it with anybody. And that just raises the third point, which is if your idea is so fragile that it cannot stand the light of even a single exposure, it's probably a very bad idea. It's just hard to imagine something that, if just on the a single notion of here's what it is, it disappears. It's almost always not very good. And the last one is, you know, your idea on day one is going to change based on customer feedback. So just assuming that the perfect idea you have now is the one that somebody's going to steal, again, it's just a misunderstanding of customer development. You will have another idea, and it will change continually as you get feedback. Does that help answer your question?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think we see a lot of folks who are in a mode of avoiding risk. They kind of see talking about what they're doing as a risk instead of balancing risk and thinking about, well, you know, what's all the benefit that I can gain by having these conversations versus the risk. And I think you put it well, that oftentimes, especially if you structure the conversations right, the benefits, you know, benefits outweigh the risk there. I'm looking at just the questions coming in. I think, you know, one interesting one, are VCs starting to understand the value of the business model canvas? Are they even starting to ask for this in lieu of a slide deck?
Yeah, I think, you know, in Silicon Valley now, most VCs understand the value of business model canvas and customer development. You know, I think almost all of them now give them lip service, where 5 years ago they wouldn't. So I think the business model canvas is kind of almost key. You know, most VCs don't read business plans. Some of them still might require them because they don't know what to ask for. But I think if you structure your presentation on, you know, here's our customers, here's our channel, here's our whatever, you can very quickly get their attention.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think people are moving away from or have moved away from the really, you know, really comprehensive business plan. Maybe one interesting follow-up, you know, if you swing to the other side of the spectrum, you know, we've come across VCs and investors who say, well, sure, it's important to dig into the details of the market, you know, if you're close to having the product or you're doing an incremental technology. But if you're really trying to, work on a game-changing technology, black swan sort of thing, you should probably just focus on the technology, because it's going to be so much better than everything else that the market, won't even, you don't even have to worry about the details of the market. Have you ever come across that?
Sure, and in some corner cases that's true, but go ask the people making thin film solar cells whether or not understanding the market was something they should have been thinking about. Even the best inventions have to go somewhere, and not getting out of the building, understanding market size, who the competitors, etc., usually is a fatal error. The type of customer development you're doing is different than if you were entering an existing or resegmenting in an existing market, because there you could ask existing customers, understand existing pricing, etc. But you still have to understand the impact of your potential invention or technology, and you truly have to understand where it's going to be used and what's the ecosystem around it. So everything about your business model is you're just simply not capable of understanding all of it sitting inside of your building.
One question coming in here, kind of, I guess, sort of technical around using the methodology. They say, after multiple pivots and a massively revised business model canvas, how do you respond to an investor, in this case they say a VC, that asks for your business plan and your investor presentation?
How do you respond to one that asks for a business plan? Is that the question?
Yeah, I think what they mean is, if you've revised this thing a number of times, basically, how do you talk about that with the potential investor that may have seen an older version? So you have a couple of choices.
One is you follow the golden rule, which says he who has the gold sets the rules. And you could decide that you're simply, okay, I did all this stuff, but all they want to see is a business plan and business plan summary. I'll give it to them. That's fine. You just do it. I mean, one of the nice things about it, if you go through this process, you ought to be able to write a static version of a business plan in about an hour, because you have all this data. Another is to do what I call a lessons learned presentation, which has nothing to do with proselytizing customer development in the business model canvas, but actually presenting its summary. One of the mistakes that people who initially kind of fall in love with this idea make is, let me tell you all about customer development, rather than giving a VC presentation that says, here was my initial idea. It's not the canvas, has nothing to do, here was my initial idea. Here were the customers, here was the market, etc. And, normally VCs are like ready for you to defend the idea. And then your next slide is, and let me tell you why we found out that was a dumb idea after talking to 45 customers. VCs are kind of like looking up off of their iPhones for the first time. And then your second slide, or third slide is, and then let me tell you, after talking to another 54 customers, here's what we found. And now they're really paying attention. Well, you've talked to 100 customers? Yeah, and we found this and this about the partners and about our value proposition, but, we actually made one more change. Boom, next slide. And now they're like looking at each other going, what are we looking at? And finally, you say, after talking to 130 people, we got initial orders from these, 5. And what we're here for is, after talking to 150 people, we think we understand X, Y, and Z, and we need money for scale. Boy, that's the ultimate VC presentation, is because you're not going to get any argument about channel or customers or markets or pricing, because, unless you clearly were deaf, dumb, and blind, you're actually telling them about a journey you've made rather than a single point in time. And the problem is that most entrepreneurs are afraid to say, let me tell you the number of ways I screwed up. I always think it's kind of cool to say, let me tell you how I screwed up on someone else's nickel. And that, why I'm here is I've stopped screwing up because I think I found something that's repeatable and scalable. That's a much more interesting presentation. And it doesn't guarantee success, but boy, you will have their interest and attention. And rather than them telling you their 400 opinions, they will be asking you about the people you've talked to and what you've learned.
Right. So rather than be embarrassed, you should boast about the fact that you can adapt and learn.
Actually, yes. And actually, actually, I'd be thinking that I'm talking about the journey, and the journey is kind of the part that's interesting.
Yeah.
So one more idea. You could fake a business plan in a research library in a weekend. You can't fake talking to 100 customers. And therefore, you can't fake talking about what you've learned from 100 customers. You can fake, here's the total available market, here's the, potential, and the difference is palatable.
All right. So you can't fake the journey. I guess that's the take-home point.
Yep.
Speaking of kind of the 100 customers and the calls, we've got a couple of questions here around how do you actually get attention of customers? They may not think they have time to listen to you. What about the first contact? Does cold calling ever work?
Well,
what are some of the tactical things you've learned there?
Unless you've been living in a cave, that probably sometime in your career you've met other people. Either your peers or at conferences, or you have friends who know other people. And typically the first kind of conversations I have entrepreneurs start with are friends of friends or friends of yours. And the idea is to just kind of practice the customer development process. And remember, what you're trying to do on day one is not pitch your idea, even though that's the natural instinct. The first thing you're trying to do is test the problem and then the solution, because what you're looking for is, trying to validate the key hypotheses in the business model canvas. You're trying to, in particular, trying to validate the most important, which is the the product and the market. And you're doing that by trying to understand enough about the customer archetype and what the fit is, what the MVP, minimum viable product, is to serve that archetype. And so once you run out of friends and now you're starting to figure out how to get to people who might be interesting, there's a couple of heuristics. One is never call the most important person you think you ought to be talking to in your first set of calls. And the reason why is, if you think you ought to be talking to a CIO or a VP of engineering, I will bet almost anything that whatever you say in the first call to them, if you actually got the meeting, you're going to think you were a complete idiot 6 months later, because you didn't understand enough about their company, or you didn't understand enough about the business, or et cetera. I tend to actually practice on lower level individuals in a company before I get the first big meeting. And that's counter to your intuition, is, gee, a board member or an investor could set me up with a CEO or whatever. I tend to tell those people, run away fast, because there's no possible way you could get it right, and you don't get to have a second meeting with them. The second thing is, tactically, the way I used to set up cold calls is I would call somebody after 5 p.m. when their secretary is gone, and leave them, hopefully not a voicemail, but get them on the phone and say, listen, you don't know me, but I got your name from X. And X should be somebody in their company that's a peer or a relationship, even if you had to make it up from the phone book. And then two is, because you want to make this short, say, and they said you were the smartest person they knew in this industry. Boy, now you got my attention. Really? I am the smartest person? And listen, I don't want to sell you something. So now you've said, oh, this is not a sales call. I only need 15 minutes of your time. I'm trying to understand, this market. So now, first of all, my calendar doesn't even have something as short as 15 minutes of time. And of course, you're not going to have a 15-minute meeting unless you really screw it up. So now you've almost made the call. It's hard to say no, and it's not that people won't turn you down. The hit rate on this one will only be, somewhere between 20 and 50%. But that's a lot better than, hi, I'm calling you because we're building a company and we'd like to eventually sell you something. I'd like an hour of your time in the middle of your important day. Does that help?
Yeah. No, I think those are some really good tactical points. The only thing I would add is, I tend to think that in the world of Facebook and LinkedIn, et cetera.
Right, your whole social net, et cetera. Right.
Yeah, I don't know if cold calling really exists anymore, right?
Well, I still believe, and I wanted to be clear, I would not be using Facebook and Twitter to set up these meetings. That is, I would use them to have a phone conversation. you truly, as much as possible, want to have some verbal or eyeball connection, either Skype or phone call, etc., to set up a meeting. It's a lot harder to turn somebody down when you're listening to their voice or you're watching their pupils dilate.
Right. So, yeah, so do it live, right? Do it in person.
As much as possible.
We're getting a few questions here, which I think are important ones around basically how universal some of the model and some of the methodologies you talk about are, and specifically thinking about, well, you know, a lot of the thinking around rapid iteration was developed kind of around this lean startup idea, very focused on IT, and you know it seems like some of the classes, Steve, that you taught initially were focused in that same space. The NSF work you've done is really more about kind of materials, maybe biotechnology, engineering, where we're talking about, you know, longer horizons, more capital, and so there's kind of a question here of, and I guess, you know, from the time you might be thinking about the early technology development, you may be 1, 2, 3 years away from those first orders, right? First sales orders, et cetera. So what are some of the things you found and on the differences of how to approach this for those types of sectors?
Yeah, you know, the number one is the business model canvas is almost identical for, that is, obviously the details are different, but there is no difference in the canvas. The real questions are about the customer development process. And it's funny when I hear this question because I first implemented this when I was doing semiconductor companies. I first actually got rich off of it was when I was doing an enterprise software company. Eric Ries, my best student, when he wrote the Lean Startup, was writing about it in a online game company, essentially, which is, software. The NSF, as you mentioned, uses it for materials and medical devices and life sciences. I've been teaching it at the Clean Tech Open in clean tech and energy for the last couple of years. Bloom Energy used it in the clean tech and in energy to kind of manage their process. So I've yet to find, and actually the biggest one is I stopped, or I didn't let people attend the class if they were in life sciences, basically telling them, well, this is the one domain it doesn't work, until a good number of teams forced their way into the class and showed me that not only does it work, it's essential. And so we have life sciences teams. I guess I have to say I've yet to find a domain where it doesn't work. But let's be clear about what it does and what it doesn't. So what the customer development and business model canvas process is doing is reducing customer and market risk. So if you think about different products and industries on a continuum of, let's say on the left side, have customer and market risk, Web 2.0 and mobile apps, et cetera, versus those that have technology invention risk all the way on the right side, life sciences, et cetera. Semiconductors have some of that. There's really a continuum of what this process could help with, and explicitly what it can't help with. It can't prove out the science. So if you have technology and invention risk, not only do you need customer and business development to reduce market risk, but you need now different tools to simulate the technology. So if you were doing jet engines or airplanes, you would be using simulation tools like computational fluid dynamics. If you were doing life sciences and doing some new proteins, you might, drugs targeting proteins, you'd be using computational chemistry tools. If you were building complex mechanical devices, you'd be doing simulation with finite element analysis tools. That is, we have a whole suite of simulation tools for technology now that go in our toolkit. If you're writing code, on the left side is complete market risk. You really don't simulate much. I mean, stuff, you test, but the amount of testing you do for the technology is minimal compared to the customer and market risk. And I'll give you my favorite example is the 2 semiconductor companies I did. Well, on day one, it was all about technology and market risk, and we simulated the heck out of that new silicon. But the day engineering said, by the way, we are going to be shipping in 9 months, where the design wins, all of a sudden the business turned into customer and market risk. And what I should have been doing from day one is doing customer development. And so therefore, now back to our audience today at ARPA is, you could look at this stuff and say, well, Steve, it's all about technology and market risk. Well, not if you're not planning on selling any. I mean, if you're selling any, you have customer and market risk embedded in here, and, you know, ask all the people who thought it'd be easy to, once you got it out of the lab to, you know, scale billion-dollar industries. You know, that's not a ditch of death, that's a valley of death, not understanding funding sources and partnerships with the utilities, et cetera. Does that make sense at all?
Yeah, no, it does. Well, I'm curious, you know, as you move to the NSF, you're working with NSF, it seems like you started working with more and more kind of academic researchers.
Yeah.
And, you know, from my experience personally, you know, I find, you know, in the academic environment, you seem to really focus on the technology, and you may not be thinking about customer development because it's not your job, but also the communities are pretty separate in many cases. And so, you know, my experience was, you know, I'm in the lab, I'm working on developing a technology that I think, you know, is way better than anything out there, and it's going to change the world. And then, you know, once I start learning about what that actually means, what the application looks like, et cetera, you realize, wait a second, you know, for these three reasons, which have nothing to do with whether or not the technology is going to work, and have more to do with whether I'm building the right technology, you know, what I'm doing doesn't seem as relevant as it could be. So did you kind of find a lot of evidence of that in the NSF experience?
Well, remember, the NSF classes are people who have raised their hand and volunteered for this. They implicitly or explicitly have said, yeah, we do have the world's hottest technology, but, you know, we do kind of want to build a company, and, yeah, something tells us that maybe we ought to understand what these things called customers are. And what, you know, what this thing called the business model is, that could probably be useful to us as well. You know, number one, you got to want to do this. I can't assign this to you. So I'd say there's a large percentage of people who, for their first startup, will want to believe that, thanks, but this process is for other people. We got it perfectly right. We'll be seeing those people after their first one fails. Because for some people, it's not until you've actually had a failure that you realize that while you might be the smartest person in your lab or even in your university, you're not smarter than the people who buy your products, at least collectively. And there's a ton that you need to learn from them, or else you're going to be selling off your furniture in your first company.
Right. Another related question, I bet this will be a quick one, because I think I know what your answer will be, but does this model work for an engineering services offering as opposed to a technology product offering?
So how does the question is, how does the business model and customer development work for services as well as products? You know, that's just looking at the canvas and saying, how would that work for different sets of applications? You know, let me have somebody else answer that. You know, the expert in this would be somebody like Alexander Osterwalder, and who wrote the book on Business Model Canvas. It would be great to have him answer that question, wouldn't it? Don't you think?
Do you happen to have him in the room?
Yeah, I happen to be in the room, so I can take the answer. Alexander Osterwalder on the phone.
All right, thanks for being here. That's great.
My pleasure. So, you know, there are a lot of technology companies that are realizing today that even great technology doesn't give them a very long competitive advantage. So they're trying to mix that more and more with services. And what, you know, people realize after a while when they start working with services is that changes the business model very much. So when you look at product companies that want to make services, or service companies that are looking at how to reinvent themselves, they realize very quickly that it affects a lot of parts of their business model. So they actually need a tool to look at their organization in a more holistic way. So that's where the business model canvas is actually pretty handy, because you look at 9 different building blocks and how those are affected by your different decisions. So typically, if you introduce a new service, if you introduce you address new segments, you'll see that will have huge implications on many other pieces of the business model. So you need a tool that allows you to think this through in order to come up with the best solutions. So a lot of companies are starting to use this not just to reinvent their business model, but, you know, say they want to introduce new services, to figure out how does that actually affect their business model. Because you will need different resources, you will need different activities, and that will have different cost implications. That will maybe allow you to have different revenue streams that are more recurring and not just transactional. So it's actually a pretty exciting field to start thinking more and more about services, in particular if you are in a product or technology domain, because that might not be what keeps you ahead in markets over the coming decades.
Well, I guess one thing I'd add is, I mean, I think in the energy space, we've also seen quite a number of companies that just cross over, right? Where you start out thinking you're going to be building a product, and then you realize you'll go to services, and even the other way around. So, you know, it seems like what you're saying makes perfect sense.
I think there's one example, if I can add, that I'm really excited about, which is Edison. So Edison is today the biggest supplier of solar energy in the U.S. still, I think. And what's interesting there is that there's an entrepreneur behind this story of Edison. His name is Jigar Shah. And he had this vision of, you know, getting as many companies as possible to adopt solar energy. So initially you'd think, well, you know, technology innovation is the way forward. But what he realized is that the biggest pain for companies to adopt solar energy was, in fact, that the upfront investments to put solar panels on their roof were enormous, right? And that was holding them back. That was the biggest customer pain. So Jigar Shah tried to figure out, well, how could he reduce that pain? How could he eliminate it? And, you know, the simplest answer is you give away the solar panels for free. Now, everybody can do that, but how do you give away solar panels for free and make a profit off of it? And what he came up with was an innovative business model with services around services that allowed him to offer solar panels for free, but earn money in a different way with services. And with that new business model, he transformed the solar energy industry. In fact, he brought solar energy to grow in an incredible way, which was not possible before. So through this business model innovation, with a new service, he could address the biggest pain of the customer, in fact, eliminate it, and transform an entire industry. So in this case, service innovation and business model innovation allowed him to unlock an opportunity that was not accessible before. So technology innovation is important, and it will always be. But you want to think about the other opportunities as well, like service innovation or business model innovation. And if you really get good at it, you're going to be able to combine both, just like companies like Apple or Amazon have been doing over the last decade. That's when you get really powerful at this game of technology innovation, business model innovation, and service innovation together.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great example, and I think we've seen that catch on to other sectors in energy as well. I mean, Steve mentioned Bloom has been using third-party financing and a service model more recently, and Better Place in electric vehicles is, I think, a pretty big example of the services and model innovation. So that's great.
Okay.
We only have a few more minutes here, but I'd love, you know, to just, there have been 3 or so questions that came in all in the same theme, which I think would be a good note to finish on, which is, it seems to be from graduate students and kind of new entrepreneurs saying, how can I reduce the learning curve for learning how to do this, to tech technologies out, to whether it's entrepreneurial or otherwise?
I'm not sure I understand the question. Is how do I shortcut this and become a domain expert, or
I think it's a question of, you know, I'm new to this. What are the most important things that I should be doing to be effective and get up to speed?
The first one is, particularly if you've never done a startup, that typically means you've never failed in business. And so if you've never failed in business, this process kind of seems to be the equivalent to the Fahrenheit to Celsius conversion table, meaning it's nice to have and you don't appreciate it until you're freezing in the winter and your thermometer is only in one scale and another and you need to do the conversion. It's a long way to say is that I would actually spend some time outside your lab or outside your office in actually testing your hypotheses. I mean, I would just pick the hypotheses, one or two, that you're absolutely convinced that people will need X or that the customers are Y. And I would start learning the skills of both getting out and asking questions and starting to network and figuring out how to do that, again, without pitching your product. The goal is not on these first couple of conversations to sell anything or to even get a reaction to the specific product you're building, but understand that implicitly in every business model and every idea you have an implicit implicit set of thoughts that you're solving someone's problem or fulfilling their need. I want you to get out and prove to yourself that that's the case, or come back kind of like, you know, with your head spinning around going, gee, I was so convinced that people would want X or buy Y. No one else seems to have this problem, or what you typically find is they might have the problem, but it's number 48 on their list of other things. That's what I would suggest.
Well, I think as an agency built on a foundation of science and technology, I think we can get behind an approach which is all about hypothesis-driven discovery.
Right. So just to close, by the way, you know, it's funny you say that. For years, I wanted to say that, but said there's no one who would believe me. It was the NSF who said what we have here is the scientific method for entrepreneurship, and it was nice to hear it from them rather than me. And just simply stated is that, yes, scientists have spent their entire career testing hypotheses inside of a lab. This is nothing more than hypothesis testing with people you don't know, instead of physical objects, with human beings and with businesses. And if you understand how to do that as a scientist, then you'll understand to do that here. There's just different skills you need to learn. And just like in the lab, there is no way you assume that your initial hypotheses about something are correct, and that's why we have the scientific method, and that's why people spend their careers testing things in the lab. This is exactly the same thing, and the results actually are equivalent.
Well, Steve Blank and special appearance by Alexander Osterwalder, thank you both for being here and taking the time to do this live session. For those who tuned in, we hope you enjoyed and appreciated it. Just as a reminder, the video recording of Steve's presentation and a copy of his slides will be available on our website, and I think anyone who signed up and was online will get an email with that detailed information. Have a great afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us.